Good morning, folks. It is Monday, April 27th. You're watching Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit. I am the People's Pundit, Rich Barris. I'm joined by Tim the Source Anderson, and we're going to talk. We have a lot to talk about today. A lot on the markets. We're going to spend a segment on the markets and the economy. We're going to talk about polling. We got some states reopening. Not a big economic calendar day today, folks. So we're looking at the Dallas Fed, and that's about it. But since we were gone over the weekend, there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to kick it over to Tim. Let's see what's going on with the markets. We got small business loans resuming today, Tim, too today, Tim. We're going to get into that when you come back. So why don't I just flip it off to you? You tell us what's going on, and we'll take it from there.
Well, stocks are starting the week with a positive note, completely different story than last week when we had the big sell-off Monday and Tuesday that was really instigated by the major capitulation trade in oil that went on Monday and Tuesday. Also, last week, of course, we started out with a 5% decline for the market averages the first 2 days, and by the end of the week, the Dow was only down 2%. The S&P was down 1.3%. The Nasdaq was down like 0.25%, and the Russell 2000 was actually positive on the week by about 4 points, or what was really just like 0.25%. So we're going to watch the Russell 2000 very closely this week. Really want to see if it can get through that 1250, 1260 level. It closed out the week at 1233. It is up today along with the other market averages. We're only about 30 minutes into the day, but the Dow is up about 140 points. The S&P is up about 25 points. That's about just less than 1%. The Nasdaq is up 1.25%, and the Russell 2000 is up 2%. If it can hold those gains on the day, that's going to be a very positive.
I don't want to speak over Tim. He looks like he glitched on my end, but on Friday this happened, and he didn't really glitch. So I don't want to speak over him too long. But as long as if he's frozen on this end, then I'll just take the chance and say it. He'll pop back in. He always does. But just for everybody who's following along, when we talk about these stories today, I had a little bit of an early jump on the day, and I was able to put the stories below on Facebook, so or on YouTube rather. So we're going to talk about these stories, and as we do, if you want to follow along, they're down in link below, or at least most of them are. The SBA one is. And then, as is the title on the show today, we're going to talk about when general election polls get predictive. And right now, that'll be in the later segment. Right now, I really want to talk about the SBA because Tim's talking about he'll be back. I'll want to talk about the SBA loans kicking off. So we all know what happened here. There was a 12-day delay and jobless claims last Thursday. You know, the whole idea behind the payroll protection program was to stop that from happening. Okay. We didn't really see that, however. So, it could have been worse. And we saw the decline last Thursday, which tells us at least on some level, this thing worked. But there was a 12-day delay. This program ran out of money just 1 day shy of 2 weeks. So about 13 days after banks started taking applications. Like they did with the CARES Act, Democrats wanted a laundry list of stuff. That didn't happen. They wanted bigger money for hospitals and states. Really, states just got money for testing. All right. So again, you can follow along, guys, down at the bottom below. Tim, when he pops in, it'll notify me. But SBA resumes PPP loans for small businesses. Right. So today they will begin again to administer this money that was passed in the $484 billion 3.5 phase 3.5 stimulus bill. Look, they're going to go back for 4, guys. I'm just going to tell you this right off the bat. Whether or not there are people in the business side of this that say that this won't be enough, it really depends on when these states begin to open up. It would be enough. And, if these states didn't shut down everything. I mean, this is supposed to be a Band-Aid. This is not supposed to be something that floats us through the summer. I don't even think there's anyone out there who would argue that that is even possible. But in reality, this is where we're at. So let's just talk about what's going to happen here, right? So this is from a joint statement from Mnuchin and Carranza, who runs the SBA, right? And this is what they said. The PPP, and this numbers are important here because if they're accurate, then it tells us a lot about what we can expect on Thursday when this new claims report comes out. So the PPP has supported more than 1.66 million small businesses and protected over 30 million jobs for hardworking Americans. What they're trying to say here is that we could be almost 60 million Americans out of work if without this program. So if that's true, then what damage was done in that 12-day period where they weren't, that they just simply weren't there? I wish, if Tim's not going to pop in, then after I do this, we'll move over to polling because I want to save this for him. I want to get his thoughts on this, because are they trying to tell us that there would be 30% unemployment? I mean, I just don't know where they're going with this. But with the additional funds appropriated by Congress, tens of millions of additional workers will benefit from this critical relief. Again, I'm not going to get into this whole story, but Democrats kind of held this up the whole way through. When they were originally debating the CARES Act, the Thursday before the week it actually passed, they had basically a framework of a deal. Nancy Pelosi rolled into town, held everybody up, and it wasn't until Sunday that they had hatched it out, or thought they had hatched it out. It fell apart that weekend. And then Monday through Thursday, essentially, they had to go back to the drawing board, and that's the actual CARES Act, where Democrats got their money for endowments and whatever. 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks later, the payroll protection program runs out of money. Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans, they try to re-up it with $250 billion, and Democrats kill it again. They used a procedural, unanimous consent, a procedural gimmick to kill it. So we saw about 12 days where this thing was in limbo. And the National Federation of Independent Businesses, other K Street lobbyists, they were, it's a lobby. It is what it is, folks. The lenders have a lobby. Small businesses have a lobby. Everybody but you has a lobby. But the National Federation of Independent Business is the biggest single small business voice in the nation's capital. And they wanted about 400 and something billion, around 400 billion, plus 250 that was earmarked for small businesses with 20 employees or less. And that was really where this program, at least in the early stages, had fallen short. So when people, and you're going to hear it, they're going to say, this isn't enough, we need more. They're going to cite those small businesses who really didn't get it the last time around. That's what this money is for. There is some differences in this bill than there was from the initial CARES Act, and the SBA had to take that time in between when this was passed and from when this was administered today. They had to take that time from then until now to be able to put those new provisions into work so they could administer it. But he hasn't popped back yet. So I'm going to move on in a second onto the other segment on the polling, because I really want to get his thoughts on this, on what this means for unemployment. But in any event, we're going to see this Thursday, that 12-day delay between the time that the PPP ran out and the time that this was passed and now administered today. We're going to see what kind of damage may have been done, if any, because if you were watching last Thursday, you'd know that this trend arrested, or at least started to arrest, last Thursday. We went from 5.5 million new initial claims to about 4.4. Those are a lagging indicator. So if it did its job, and if the money was if the money was missing, and people needed that and they were laying people off, we're going to see that in unemployment claims, and we're going to see it on Thursday. All right. So let me get just flat back into this. So, Trump signed it, folks. What else is he supposed to do? I know a lot of people who are actually Trump supporters who are getting a little bit fed up with this, but this is the engine of the American economy. This is the SBA definition of small business may not be what Main Street thinks of small business, but this is the engine of the American economy. So in a nutshell, there's going to be calls for more money. It's going to happen. We all know where I stand on this. They should just open this back up and they wouldn't need this money. They wouldn't need it anymore, but they haven't been able to do that. So, all right. So basically, I'll leave that up, for now, but I would like to just move along here, and I'm going to pull up another screen altogether because I don't Tim's not here right now, so he can't defend himself. So I'm trying to be careful. I don't want to I'll wait till he pops back in to let him defend himself. But the fact of the matter is, folks, this was always going to happen. We're starting to see now in the battleground states that we've been over in the voter analysis, we talked about a million times. In the beginning, during crisis, it is always going to be true that people are afraid and they don't make decisions that are, or they don't have opinions that are like long-term views until it really sinks in. During the financial crisis, everybody thought that almost everybody thought that Congress had to pass that bailout. It was not until months and months later, even into Obama's term, when it became a more, prevalent argument, a more sustainable, widely shared argument that it wasn't a good idea. And I've been saying in different forms for weeks that you have these Twitter pundits out there and they're, well, look at the polls, nobody agrees with you. It doesn't take a political genius to look at a poll, which is a snapshot in time, a picture right then and there. It doesn't take a political genius at that time to look at a poll and try to determine what's the politically smart strategy to take. I'll be impressed by some of these Twitter pundits. I'll be impressed when you can look at polls as a snapshot in time. And you can say 2 weeks from now, a month from now, 2 months from now, in November, people are going to vote based on this. They're going to believe this. Their opinion is going to change like this. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, there were a ton of polls. People agreed with the lockdown. People agreed with social distancing. Where's it at now? When they first polled it in April 3rd, and this is a CNBC poll. For those of you not a Trump-friendly poll, it's conducted by change.org. On April 3rd in Michigan, 9% thought that the response to the virus, the mitigation efforts, the lockdown orders, the social distancings, the stay-at-homes, whatever you want to call it, and social distancing is different than locking down. You could not be locked down, but still practice social distancing. But in any event, they had put this together. And on April 3rd in Michigan, this very same poll had only 9% of people who thought that it was too aggressive. On April 18th, that number has now shot up to 47%. 41% think that it's just right. 9% think it's not aggressive enough. Again, if you go back to April 3rd in the state, this is just the state of Michigan. If you go back to April 3rd, 42% said these policies were not aggressive enough. An equal number, 42%, said they were just right. And about 7% were not sure. So what does that tell you? Now in this new polling, 2% are not sure. So what does that tell you? I mean, there weren't enough people out there who told the pollster they didn't know, they had no opinion. There weren't enough people out there for this to be because the undecided vote decided. People changed their minds. They changed in a very important battleground state. For those who watched the voter analysis, then Michigan followed closely by Pennsylvania. But Michigan will be the hardest state for Donald Trump to keep. Pennsylvania will be the second hardest. out of the ones that he won in 2016. That is the area of the country where we went over. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Those are the 3 states where Joe Biden can end this thing early on election night if Donald Trump is defeated. Don't you think it's probably important to get this right? I mean, if you want the president to be reelected, because I'm specifically referring to people who are supposedly Trump supporters who went on Twitter and made this case. This was always going to happen. This pivot was always going to happen. This was a classic rhetoric versus reality slip, and reality always wins. It always wins. People's pocketbooks and their personal situation will always overtake the media narrative if given enough time. Let's look at Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania on the 3rd, 17% thought that it was too aggressive. 17%. 40% thought it was just right, and 38% thought that it was not aggressive enough. Very close to Michigan. About 4-point difference. Thought it was not aggressive enough to have stay-at-home orders and lockdowns. But by April 18th, again, very similar number, 41% now think it's too aggressive. 41%. Still 40% think it's just right, so it's much closer in Pennsylvania. But 16% say it's not aggressive enough, and 3% are undecided. I'll tell you, that sounds like it's better for the stay-at-home and lockdown crew, but give it a little bit longer, folks, because again, back on April 3rd, only 5% were undecided. That tells you people changed their minds. They changed their minds. Wisconsin is somewhere in between when we're talking about the shift, how drastic it was. It's somewhere in between Michigan and Pennsylvania. So it's not as good for the lockdown crew as Pennsylvania, even though that is not a good poll. That is a bad poll that showed they did not have foresight enough to know how this thing was going to shake out in the end. But Wisconsin is somewhere in between. 44% now think these policies were too aggressive. That compares to just 18% who said that on April 3rd. 38% now think they were just right. That's down from 43 on April 3rd. And 15% think it's not aggressive enough. Only 4% are undecided. In the first poll, 7% were undecided. So again, on the April 3rd poll, there was not enough undecideds to justify this flip. This is from people changing their minds, which does not happen often in this game, folks. People don't change their minds that dramatically for the same reasons, unless we're talking about issues of a crisis, and then during the crisis, they think one way, and that thought pattern changes dramatically when other facts start to pile in. That's what happened here. This is a classic rhetoric versus reality situation. And people acting in the moment and making opinions on the moment just didn't have the foresight to see what was going to go on. They just didn't have it. We're 20 minutes after here. So basically, my point here is on Twitter for the last 2 weeks, I've been trying to tell people that you simply aren't thinking big enough. You're not thinking in the big picture here. You're just not. And now here we are. These are going to get worse. If you look inside the polling for Rasmussen Reports, they've been doing this, and I thought they asked more constructive questions. It wasn't simply whether or not you agreed with it or you didn't agree with it. They asked more constructive questions about which one they were more concerned about, getting the coronavirus and the health problems or the financial impact. Inside of those numbers was always the foundation for this shift. And it's going to get worse. And other pollsters who, should be able, to catch it. And if they don't, they're going to be the minority. This is going to happen. There's Tim. He beat back in. But before I go back to Tim, because he can do this whole segment on the SBA, I want to get his thoughts on it. Just listen to this for a second. Like Pew and others, on April 16th, Rasmussen found only 36% of likely voters thought it was time for America to get back to work, a little over a third. 49% disagreed, and 15% were undecided. 58% were more concerned personally about the health impact of the coronavirus than its financial impact. The same was only true for 36% who are worried about the financial impact more than the coronavirus. But again, this is not uncommon during a time of crisis. People to have these decisions that are based on the rhetoric and the narrative, not based on the reality that's going to hit them later on. Just 33% believe the U.S. could afford to remain locked down. This is like inside that people were concerned about the headline numbers, but they weren't concerned about, hey, Tim, I can see you're there. I'm just trying to wrap something up real quick, all right? They weren't concerned about what was inside. Just the headline got, the coverage, got the blog posts out there from the Twitter pundits. But inside, the foundation for this shift was always there. 33%, a third back on April 16th, thought that the U.S. could afford to remain locked down as long as government officials said was necessary. Another 23% were only willing to extend it to May 1st. That's Tim right there, the May 1st person. And then while just 27% were willing to push it out until June. Only 12%, folks, believe the country could do this until the end of summer. This was always going to turn around. And also within that, even back then, 59% still were concerned. They worried that the cure was worse than the disease. Now, by the way, by April 20th, very close to that other new poll from change.org, by April 20th, 57% of adults had grown to be very concerned about the financial impact of the coronavirus. When Tim pops back, all right, we're going to go back into the SBA. He's right there. When he pops back, I want to get his thoughts about the SBA. And then on the next segment, we're going to talk about the economy in greater detail. That was supposed to be the first segment, but when he bleeped out, we improvised. And then we'll get into when general election polls are actually predictive. All right, because there's a lot of crap there. Hey, Tim, welcome back, buddy.
Hey,
I wanted to save the SBA for you. So I ran through it real quick, and I want to get your thoughts on a couple of things. But
sure.
But then I jumped into some of the new polling out there from Change. But yeah, so we went over the SBA loan deal.
Right.
Mnuchin over at Treasury.
Yep.
And this is why I jumped over it real quick. But Mnuchin, let me just read this again. People who were listening before heard it. But all right, so PPP has supported more than 1.66 million small businesses and protected over 30 million jobs for hardworking Americans. If 27 million are out of work, Tim, is he trying to say there would be 57 million unemployment claims? I mean, or is he just? What do you think about that? How do we put that square into a round hole?
I think that there could be a little bit of double counting from when, if people filed first-time unemployment claims before their company secured their SBA loan,
right,
to then keep them on the payroll, they very likely could be now dropping off unemployment as soon as that money goes through to their workers.
I know somebody who that happened with already.
Clearly, you're not supposed to stay on unemployment if the company is going to be paying you with money that it's going to be getting from the SBA loans. So I think that to answer your question, I just think there could be some double counting where some people had filed first-time unemployment claims. They're going to be getting money. Maybe they haven't gotten it yet. Maybe it's going to show up at the end of the month, which is in a couple of days. Maybe it's going to show up the first couple of days of April in terms of the money going from the SBA to the companies and then to the employees. I don't know what the lag time on that is, but it's very possible some people may have filed first-time unemployment claims right away and then started getting, at which point they'll then come out of that unemployment pool, but it was still a first-time unemployment claim.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay,
Right.
because when I was just kind of breezing over it to give people the
60 million would be a lot. I mean, maybe it's 45 million.
I do know somebody who works for a private physician, and obviously they have a connection with a private surgeon, actually, but they're considered elective surgery,
Right.
right?
Right.
And of course, they work with the hospital. They work out that everyone's got to, but when he does the actual work, but it's his wife, my buddy's wife, and she does electives.
Yeah.
She was put out of work in April, or no, in March. But then he got the PPP loan, and then she is now back on payroll.
Right.
So she's back to work. And because in my state they're going to reopen electives, she doesn't
Right.
have to worry. So she would that makes sense to me. What you're saying makes sense to me. It would be at least some degree of double counting
Right.
in that. Right.
I
Okay.
just don't think you can take all the people that filed first-time unemployment claims plus the number that Treasury is saying are being paid through the SBA to their company and then to the employee, and add that together and say that many people have been affected. There's no doubt
Too
that an astronomical amount of people are out of work. There's no doubt about it. But and some people, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're back operating in a economically productive capacity.
Yeah.
Because they may be getting paid by their company through that loan, and the company does have to use 75% of that money for payroll, to make it to turn that loan into what would be a grant.
Yeah, so it's forgivable, folks, up if you use 75% of what you get
for salaries, wages, and benefits, I would imagine.
Yeah, there probably is some other stuff lumped in there, but as for payroll, as it typically is when people do payroll every week, right? So to make the numbers simple, if you got $100,000 PPP loan and 75,000 of it was used for payroll, or like Tim said, I think there are some exceptions in there, but I don't want to get into that. I don't want to tell you something that may not be right. Talk to your lender. But 75,000 you used, which is 75% of 100,000, on payroll, that is forgivable. So it turns into a grant and it's no longer a loan. If you don't, then a good share of that is going to turn into like a low interest small business loan. It's just that they waived a lot. It's just like anybody else who wants to get a startup loan or a small business flow loan. Basically, they waived things that you would normally have to go through, to be able to do that, to be able to qualify. So, and that was part of why this took a couple of days to iron out, Tim, according to the small.
They rolled that program out so incredibly fast.
Yeah.
And then it was just a program of that size, basically to be rolled out in a week, is just astounding. So clearly, there were some glitches in it, and there were a few wrinkles that needed to be ironed out. And I think that they've done a pretty good job with that. And they've got some of the little quirks out of it, a couple unintended consequences. That's why they didn't want public companies to be taking that money, under the theory that those companies, basically, they didn't want any companies that had any other avenue from which they could come up with funding to be taking that money, because then that would potentially shut out companies that didn't have another avenue for funding that would need that money. And I'm sure there will be cases of people that, well, we didn't get the loan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had to close. But look, they did a tremendous amount. We'll see how much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of numbers on how many bankruptcies were filed, how many stores, how many restaurants don't reopen, how many small businesses don't come back.
Yeah. But for a government program. We have never seen one that large. The SBA handles, just to give people an idea, they're going to be close to $1 trillion, administering close to $1 trillion in a big year, folks. You're talking about 60 billion. I mean, that's how much they have up their game over there. So
Right.
for a government program, there's, like Tim said, there's always going to be, that's the nature of the economy. And the government cannot, contrary to what some people say, the government simply cannot supplant, other market mechanisms. They can try, but there's going to be, inherent failures there.
Right.
But for the most part, this was done quick. And then we can talk too about claims and that 12-day window when we get back from the market update here. But just before we go, I do want to make a point too. Last week we talked about what was holding up that provision that earmarked a certain amount for smaller companies. They got that. Trump signed this bill on Friday. They over the weekend they put together what was necessary to make some of those community development financial institutions, those CDFIs. They did that over the weekend, Tim.
Right.
I mean, that's remarkable. Government never does something this big over the weekend like that. I mean, it's just a point. So for whatever failures people might talk about with this program, it was an incredible feat. But all right, it's 10:31. Hopefully, no more glitches. It's 10:31. Hopefully, I don't glitch like I did last week. On Monday, April 27th, you are watching Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit. I am the People's Pundit. You can follow me along, folks, at People's_Pundit on Twitter. And I'm joined by Tim the Source Anderson. Follow him at TJ Anderson1. Guys, we did good over the weekend with YouTube subscribers. So keep it up. Share it with your friends and family. If you haven't subscribed yet and you're watching, do not forget to subscribe. We're going to hit that milestone and give us those thumbs up, and on Periscope, give us the hearts, which I see some of you doing right now. And if you haven't followed the account you're following, go ahead and do so. All right. So the ultimate way to subscribe, though, is to subscribe to PPD. And you can do that by going to ppdnews.us/subscribe. Or you could just go to People's Pundit Daily, find the digital subscription link, and check them out. All right. So let's do this market update, Tim. I'm going to need like 2 or 3 minutes. All right. And I'll be right back. Okay.
Sure.
Tell us what's going on.
So I think one of the most interesting things going on right now is that stocks are going in a very different direction than oil. Oil is down $4 or 25%. It went out at the end of last week a little bit above $16, and it's now trading at about $12.80. So, of course, last Monday and Tuesday, when oil went into its what I call the capitulation trade, that was very negative for stocks. And stocks took that not well at all, going down 5% in a period of 2 days. So I haven't really completely thought it through yet. I don't know exactly like what the rationale for it is, but oil is down 25%, trading at $12.80. You have one bankruptcy in the field. Diamond Offshore has filed bankruptcy. I don't think it really surprised a lot of people that have been following the situation. They did miss a bond payment last week. And they are a company that's basically contracted by the major international oil companies for deep water drilling. It's a high cost way to get oil out of the ground. Some of these rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, you're talking about, going down through, half a mile of water and then drilling below that another couple of miles to get to the oil. So that's an expensive way to get oil out of the ground, particularly when there's, just an unbelievable amount of oil being stored everywhere it can possibly be stored right now, either in big oil tanks that you see sometimes driving in around where the big ports are, or either on tankers. There's probably 150 million gallons of oil being stored on tankers at sea right now.
Right.
So, we got to get people back on the road. We got to get the airlines back in the air, and we got to get industry fired back up to start to burn off this unbelievable oversupply of oil. But very different than last Monday and Tuesday. Stocks are moving in a different direction than oil. The S&P is up about 1%. Nasdaq's up a little bit more than that. Nasdaq's trading above 8,700. The Russell 2000 is up 2.25%. It's trading above 1260. If it can hold that move above the 1250, 1260 level, that chart is going to look very positive. And I think that bonds are selling off a little bit also. They were earlier this morning. And I think actually that would be a healthy sign. The bonds, the 10-year note traded as low as 0.5% last Monday and Tuesday. It had traded as low as 0.4% on the big panic move to the downside after, I believe, just the day after the huge price cut in oil announced by Saudi Arabia after the talks between Saudi Arabia and Russia failed to produce an agreement to cut production. I think that was on March 9th or whatever the Monday was of that week.
Yeah, earlier in the second week in March.
Right. And that bonds trading down there at 0.4 is very, I think it's a negative sign. It's a sign that the economy has just got nothing going on to it at all. The 10-year had then rallied, got up to about 0.8, 0.85. And then started to slip about a week and a half ago. So I want to see the 10-year note get back, go a little bit higher in yield, up to 0.8, 0.9, and I want to see the 30-year get up to about 1.5. They've got a ways to go to get back up there, but the market. This is a big week,
but it's
for
a
the
big
market.
difference. This
is a big week for the market. We've got tech earnings this week, and many people feel that the technology companies are some of them are actually a beneficiary of everything that's gone on with the tremendous usage in streaming and online services by everyone from that's like watching Netflix 20 hours a day to people that are working from home, streaming conference calls with friends, family, and coworkers. Certainly, Intel's numbers last week pointed to a tremendous upsurge in their services business, and we've got they call it the 3 T's, the $3 trillion companies: Microsoft, Facebook, and Apple, all reporting this week.
Yeah, it's a big week and a big difference. Without real, demand, then what do we have to explain this change today? I mean, some of it could just be the difference.
In terms of the mark, I just think people are
oil.
I think this is a headline move for the market today, based on the fact that states are starting to reopen, ease off their shelter in place guidelines, and whether some of them are doing it today or targeting May 1st, which is Thursday. You're going to start to see some aspects of the economy start to percolate a little bit, and people are just, it's a positive optic where we've had nothing but negative optics for 6 weeks. We finally got a positive optic, and I think the market is just cheering that on a little bit.
Yeah, and as far as diamond, we had spoken about this before. I think it's probably one of the first, even before we saw what oil did last week, before the coronavirus started to take demand away. There were companies like Diamond going back to the spat between Saudi Aramco, however you pronounce it, and Russia, even going back that far. Those headlines, Tim, there was a price collapse people are forgetting about, right?
Even with oil in the low 40s, where it was before the big 30% overnight decline that we got on that Sunday night, Monday morning, when Saudi Arabia, basically, gave Russia the middle finger and said, okay, you want to play this game? We'll play market share. Even with oil in the low to mid 40s, that's not a good price level for a company like Diamond Offshore.
Right.
So,
and it's probably just going to be the first And then when you were talking about the dividend before, I mean, we can expect more of that, correct?
Right. From General Motors is suspending their dividend. They're also suspending all their stock buyback activity. Some companies are going to be they're going to be very reluctant to cut their dividend. I'm thinking of a company like Chevron, who makes a very public statement that they haven't cut their dividend since the 1930s. It's got a high yield, not quite as high as Exxon. I think there's, a lot of people expect that Exxon will cut their dividend, maybe not completely eliminate it, but we'll see, but also all companies, even Intel, with their very strong earnings statement last week, said they're suspending their full year guidance. I think you're going to see all 90% of the companies that report earnings, and we're a couple of weeks into it, are going to say they're suspending their guidance on all of their financial metrics for the remainder of this year, which is the smart thing to do, because it just makes, there's just too many uncertainties out there. You just don't know what to expect in terms of getting the economy. It's going to be an uneven uptick to the economy when it happens. And there's just too many variables in play in a completely completely uncharted territory of an economy being started back up from a total halt.
Let's bring this because it's 10:41, about 11 minutes or so ago. The Dallas Fed, it's the only thing we said is a light calendar. There's literally one economic indicator on the calendar today, folks. It's the Texas Business Outlook Survey. So we have you have the manufacturing one out of the Philadelphia Fed. This is manufacturing activity as well. This is manufacturing. They all have different names. So they have the Philly Fed, the New York Fed, which is the Empire State manufacturing. Today, which is it's less cited. And maybe Tim can shine some light on that, but it's less cited by people who are looking at markets, and the markets don't move like they'll move for like the Philly Fed. But the Dallas, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas does theirs. Tim, it's not a good number, but this is much better than the consensus. There's a key production index and a general activity index. We only get the consensus range because there's the people we look at, they're the only ones who they only really look at the general headline activity index. They had a range, Tim, of -85. That was the low. Yeah. And the high was -60.7. It fell to -70 last month. But right. It's a beat. It's about a 6.3% point beat.
Well, so clearly, Texas has got to be heavily influenced by the drop off in oil.
That's why I thought to bring this in right now. Because of what we're talking about.
That is what it is. That's probably going to be one of the slower ones to get back.
Yeah.
To even -25. It's going to take a few months.
The Philly Fed is a gyrator, man. For people who don't know,
these gyrate all over the place, and for those that I think that one reason you see that a lot of volatility in these regional Fed numbers is that they do not employ seasonal smoothing in these numbers, whereas a lot of other economic data that you'll hear us talk about, whether it's retail sales or the purchasing managers index or in the national manufacturing reports there's always some, and certainly the employment reports, and we're going to get April employment reports on Friday. That'll be a very intriguing number.
And Thursday, we're going to get the initial claims.
Right. So a lot of them have what they call seasonal smoothing, where they factor in that, look, a lot of kids take summer jobs in the summer when they're home from college. A lot of those summer jobs go away when the kids go back to school. There's a lot of hiring of people for seasonal work going into the holiday season at the end of the year. Then those jobs go away after the usually after the return part of the period in January when most of the returning unwanted Christmas gifts or unused Christmas gifts. Most of those jobs are good through like mid-January or so, depending on stores' return policies.
And that's what I wanted to talk about too, was those claims before, because when we get up on 11, I want to fit it in, and we'll get Leslie, we'll get to your question. Somebody asked a great question about why public companies were even allowed to apply for the PPP loans. So that's a good question, but just wanted to let her know we're going to get there. Just for everybody, there was that 12, and I spoke about this when you glitched out, Tim. So I want to get your thoughts on it. Because you had that was great insight on why you really can't go, job for a job, count it the way that Mnuchin is talking about here. There's definitely some overlap count. I think that was a great point. But also this week, this is on Thursday, the jobless claims report that we're going to get. That's for the week that ended April 23rd. So we're going to have some of that period in there where the Democrats were playing games for 12 days. And people, if we're going to see an impact, I'm saying, then we could see it then. And I want to get your thoughts on this point that we saw, remember last Thursday, what was still a horrible number, 4.4 million, but it was an arresting of the trend, Tim. So the range right now is a low of 2 million and the high end of the range is 4.9 million. The consensus is 3.5 million. That would still be, if it came in a consensus, that would still be a decline of almost 1 million jobs. I mean, 1 million initial jobless claims from the prior week, which would continue that downward trend. And while the numbers are ugly, they are what they are. We're looking for that downward trend to continue.
I think we're going to beat that number.
You think we're going to beat that number? That halfway answers my question. Go ahead.
End of the April 23rd.
You don't think Democrats with that stall period, the 12-day stall period, you don't think that'll have much of an impact? Give me your thoughts on that, because that's what
I think it had an impact, but I mean, you're talking first-time unemployment claims. So how many more people were initially laid off just before that April 23rd week? You're definitely going to have. It's going to be a 7-figure number. I'm just thinking maybe it's going to be half what we had last week.
And I think if we already saw that, that's why my fingers are really crossed here for this report this Thursday, folks. They are crossed because that, again, if you didn't see Thursday's show, then, maybe we got to clue you in a little bit. But if you did, what we're talking about. We went over the numbers. It was going down more than like the worst case scenario, Tim. You know what I mean? So it pointed to, and other indicators did as well. So it's not just jobless claims. There's some other stuff that we've seen the worst. We've been bloodied up as much as we're going to get bloodied up. And so basically my fingers are crossed, because even with that 12-day stall period, I know a lot of people think that could have done some damage. Like,
it could have, sure.
Over at Fox Business, he made a case for it. I heard the other day, Stu Varney, he said, you know what? They could have killed our progress. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we already saw the worst. My hope here is that we saw the worst, because 4.4 will be revised. All of the other prior 2 weeks so far, Tim, have been revised down. So it wasn't, we're not talking about huge revisions.
Lower. You're gonna have that, though. I think you have to expect it.
Yeah, but it wasn't revised up, though, was my point. Like, it wasn't worse than we thought.
Right.
It was bad, but it wasn't. It was never. The revisions never, showed. Hey, it was that week was terrible, but it was worse than it was before.
Actually, I don't see the jobs report on the calendar for Friday.
It's the week after that.
It's the week after, even though May 1st is a Friday. That's the first Friday of the month.
On Friday,
typically what we're talking about is almost always the unemployment numbers come out on the first Friday of the month. Yeah. Occasionally they don't. They must be delaying them for a week. I'm sure, first of all, I'm sure they're flooded. And I'm sure that the Department of Labor, with everything else that they're doing, is just jammed with, getting this data from businesses, a lot of whom are probably shut down. So they would have taken the survey. It'll be for a survey week. That's probably the second week in the month. But who would have answered the surveys?
Yeah,
I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
And it's going to be just to give everybody a little, and we'll give you we'll give you warning even more before we get the report next week. It's gonna be ugly, folks. All right, the report for March is going to be revised to Ugly Town. It's just gonna right, Tim. I mean, the survey period for the last jobs report, which already showed, it was not even that bad, right?
Because think about it, we were in full bore shutdown mode for in that second week in April. There probably wasn't a business that wasn't, unless you were an essential business,
grocery store,
you were shut down. If you weren't a grocery store, hospital, some hardware stores I've noticed are open. A couple of them where I am in New Jersey, but they have signs on their window. We have been declared as an essential business. So I'm not sure exactly what the categorization was.
My dry cleaner's back open.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, they're back open. You're only allowed one in the lobby at a time, but the
laundromats have been open. I mean,
right? Which
is
weird.
Essential for people to have be able to wash their clothes and have clean clothes.
It's not just Florida, it's my city. So they were mad at Ron DeSantis for not issuing a stay-at-home order when they wanted him to. So my city basically issued their own. The county was the mayor, and then the county supervisor, whatever he is, the head of the council, and then the mayor of the city in the county. And they got together and they did it. And again, folks, if you haven't read your own stay-at-home order, if you have one specifically for where you live, you should read it, because it's a load of malarkey. There's a bunch of carve-outs for their buddies and their friends and their brother-in-law's business and their sister-in-law's business. It's such a load of crap here. It really is. It's a total joke. But the ones around here, I guess they could have, like a dry cleaner, they were off that list for a hot minute. And then even when, I think it was like a week or 2 weeks, Tim, that they were allowed to go back in with minimal capacity, and they didn't, which is part of what I've been arguing, that people, it's going to take some time for their conscience that fear to dissipate. It's not, just when the government says, go ahead, you can go reopen. It's going to take some time before they feel better, so that's basically what happened with this instance. And then now it's one person in the lobby at a time. And there's no option to pay a little bit more to get it done quicker like there used to be, right. So there are some consequences, but I'm just glad they're open. I'm just glad they're back, and we'll see. Because there are people you don't realize you can't live without until they're gone, Tim, right?
That's right.
I mean, but the liquor stores, that was never closed. They were never closed. They were never closed. So you can always get a bottle when you needed one.
That was never an option.
That was never an option. And that interview with Phil Murphy, that was so fun, with Tucker Carlson.
Yes.
And that's above my pay grade, but I talked to addiction experts and they told me it could actually cause a problem. You don't want alcoholics to just be going through detox, but they could have gotten care if they were going through. It's not like there was nowhere for them to go. If for those who don't know how it works in Tim's good old state over there, liquor licenses are controlled by organized crime in the state of New Jersey. You couldn't have closed them if you wanted to, Tim, and you know it. There is no way. The governor is just the governor. He passes in and out. He or she is gone at 4 to 8 years, and the powers that truly be remain. Liquor licenses, you can't just move. Maybe it's different now, I haven't lived in Jersey in years, but when I was there, you had to wait for someone who was grandfathered to close or something, and then it was like sold to the highest bidder, and that was the way it worked. And from everything from the shore, all over the place. So Phil Murphy, he didn't, like you said, it was never an option. That was not going to happen. All right. You want to try to get to Leslie's question before we move on to the next one? So, yes, you wanted a little bit more explain about why would even like publicly traded companies be allowed to apply?
Well, so I believe that what they wrote into the rules on the PPP loans was that it was for companies with fewer than 500 employees, and I can't remember the net income of less than $10 million. I don't have it right in front of me.
Everything,
but I don't have it right in front of me. If you want to look it up, but so they didn't really give any provision that you have to be a private company or not have any other access to funding. But look, there are some publicly traded companies that have fewer than 500 employees and have net income of less than $10 million. So you would say, okay, look, Shake Shack, I don't know how many Shake Shacks there are across the country. A lot of them some of them might be corporate owned. A lot of them might be franchised by restaurateurs in whatever city they're in.
And by the way,
the same thing with Ruth Chris restaurants.
By the way, with franchises, like you were just saying, though, it's 500 employees if it's a franchise or anyone with an NAICS code of 72. So like, what you were just talking about at Five Guys and Fries or something. Right. It has to be per location. So that's why some of those publicly traded companies that that you may think have 500 or more employees or more than 500, they're still eligible because it's per location actually when it comes to them. Just when it comes to them. I was just reading that and I wanted to say that.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't even aware of that.
Yeah.
So I just think that it was, again, the bill was put together in a very short period of time. And maybe just wasn't given some consideration as to where are the loopholes. But I think they've done a pretty good job. And I think most companies have been reasonably stand up about the fact that, well, look, if we would have known that it was going to cause so much flack, we wouldn't have applied for it. And some companies, I think, might be saying, look, if we applied for it and we got money, but now we've realized that we can also go get funding somewhere else that we weren't sure was going to be available initially. So we'll kick this money back. I think that most companies have been pretty stand-up-ish about it.
Yeah, there have been several reports about instances like that, Tim.
Right.
And they also, too, as of today, and this is in the article in People's Pundit Daily if people haven't read it. Also, if you haven't read the market note about what the market's trading on, technicals and news, that's on there too. I think I would link them all there, Tim, for people who are on like YouTube or something. Right. But there's also today, there's other avenues here. And I want to tell people the EIDL loan advance, that kicks back off today. That's up to $10,000 of economic relief to businesses that are, currently experiencing trouble. The SBA Express Bridge Loan and the SBA Debt Relief. There's some extras in those 4 programs during the coronavirus. 2 of those, the PPP and the EIDLs, they're re-upped. And we just talk about PPP, so a lot of people don't know the difference with the EIDL. But that's all linked there too. If you want to go and read more about it, it would be hard for Tim and I to give you all the little, small provisions in each of these. But I could just read a quick 4-point bullet, Tim, about who is and who isn't eligible, like we were just talking about.
Go ahead. Yeah.
It says specifically, and it dealing with public and private, any small business that meets the SBA size standard, either the industry-based size standard or the alternative size standard. So it doesn't matter if it's private or public, 500 or less, and there are exceptions for businesses with like codes of 72 that are accommodations and food services. So maybe you're a Hilton or something. It sounds like you're a big company or a Holiday Inn, Tim, or something. But as long as you don't have 500 employees at that location, at one physical location, then you're eligible. Sole proprietors, independent contractors, and self-employed persons are eligible for this, as are 501c3 nonprofits, 501c19 veteran organizations, tribal business, which is 31B2C in the Small Business Act, And then, of course, you have to meet the guidelines everybody else has to meet, 500 employees or less, or that meet the SBA industry size standard if more than 500, which is what we were just talking about. But yeah, I mean, go there. If you read the article about the PPP, that's all I just did to find that information. I went at the bottom of the article and it says, to learn more about it, click here. And it took me to another page. It'll take you there too, if you want to read it. It's 11 o'clock, Tim. Let's do the break.
So I see.
Oh, go ahead.
I see one comment in the stream here that just because we're on the topic, the major banks who fund loans to those companies should be fined or something. I think the reality is that this whole program was, because it was going towards small businesses and really like local businesses, it was the community banks and the smaller banks that had an easier time dealing with this program. And you'll notice that a lot of people that have different news entities have had on TV talking about their loan. What was the process like? How long did it take to get the loan? Most of the good stories were all people that dealt with their community bank, a small bank, a local bank, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the banks that typically have a lot of experience dealing with the Small Business Administration. The big banks just don't. They're just never going to be able to react with the same speed and with the same feel for who these small businesses are as the local community banks, small banks, and the bank in town that a certain business has been dealing with for 2 or 3 generations, maybe.
Yeah.
So the big banks like Chase Bank, Bank America, Citigroup, et cetera, Wells Fargo. Do they have relationships with companies that meet the characteristics? Yes. Are they always doing personal loans and loan qualification stuff for them? A lot less than you would think.
And this second bill, by the way, the second funding addresses some of that, by the way.
Yes.
So I think, right now, Tim, they just don't want to punish banks. They want them to do what they got to do, right? I mean, would you agree? Maybe
I don't think any of it was done. I don't think any of it was done maliciously.
There was some risk there too.
Maybe, maybe down the road we'll hear stories about how some money was used for purposes it shouldn't have been used for. You're talking about $350 billion plus $600 billion in total. I'm sure that some instances of abuse will somehow
find its way in there,
be found out about down the road.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, right now, the important thing is to get the money out, because on come Thursday, we want to see that trend that we saw last 2 weeks continue. We just that's most important right now, folks. And then this way, by the time, Tim, we get to August, we could see huge job reports. And even if it takes us some time to get back to where we were before, if we're seeing jobs reports like Tim and I discussed before, Reagan had 2 months, they were the highest. But we were only talking about like 700 and change, Tim, 750,000, and then like close to 1 million to 1 month. We could see
we'll hit that
huge number. I mean,
sure.
I wouldn't, if it doubled Reagan's best report, I wouldn't even be shocked. because there are people that are
Okay, so we won't get that. We won't get the April report this Friday. We'll get it next Friday.
next Friday. Yeah.
And then you'll see those jobs come back in, July and August.
That's what I'm thinking. August,
Maybe
could
June,
be a
maybe even
huge
June.
month.
So
August,
hey, some of these businesses are reopening in May.
and some of them that closed, that won't come back, like we talked about. There'll be a lot of restaurants that are going to go out of business and they will reopen under a different name, right?
Yep.
I mean, it happens. It happens in good economies in that
the restaurant business is a brutal business. There's always restaurants closing and then reopening, sometimes with the same owners, but maybe under a different company. And then they rebrand the restaurant. It has, a different, different menu, different, and sometimes all the same workers.
That's what I mean. It's like the same people, same face, different name,
Right.
All right. Well, it's 11:05. Let's get into this. When we come back, we will begin to talk about the predictive value of general election polls. And I'm going to pop up an article that I wrote in August. Speaking of August, it was just coming up on September in 2016, Tim, because there was this whole idea that nobody is behind this big, this late, whoever has gone on to win. We're gonna put that to the test and see if those claims live up to scrutiny, because I swear it's deja vu all over again, So let's go ahead and do that. So folks, you guys, it is Monday on April 27th, and you're watching Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit. I am the People's Pundit. You can follow me if you don't on Twitter at Peoples_Pundit. I'm joined by Tim the Source Anderson, and you can follow him if you don't already on Twitter at TJ Anderson 1. And if you guys are watching on Facebook Live, which I neglected last time, then go ahead and like the page, People's Pundit Daily, and it will let you know when we go live. The same thing for YouTube subscribers. We did a nice little run. Keep it up. We're doing great. Share it with other people you would know who would love the show. Tell them to subscribe, because we need to hit those milestones. And of course, give us those thumbs up. All that stuff is very important. If you want to support the show, and I got to thank those of you who have done this already while we started this show. It's only not even 2 weeks old, basically. Then the best way to do so is to go to People's Pundit Daily and subscribe through one of the digital subscriptions. The best way, easiest way to get there is the short link, ppdnews.us/subscribe. And that's how we bring you guys all this stuff. All right. So I'm going to come back from a break in a few minutes. Tim's going to give us a market update, and we're going to talk about the predictive value of general election polls. What's going on out there now, Tim, at 11:07?
Well, the market's just having a very good day today. The Dow, the S&P, and the Nasdaq are all up about 1%, very close to 1%. That's over a 200-point move to the upside in the Dow, about 85 points higher in the Nasdaq, and about close to 30 points higher in the S&P 500. The Russell 2000 is the outperformer. It's up 2.5%. It's trading above the 1250, 1260 level that has been resistance on a number of moves higher for the Russell. The Russell was clearly the index that took the hardest hit on the way down. It was down as much as 43% from its high in February to its low in the third week of March. And to see the Russell outperform, I think, is very positive. That speaks to the economy starting to get opened back up in, let's call it, about a dozen states or so.
Tell people what trades on the Russell, Tim, why this is important.
So the Russell 2000 is really stocks 1,000 through 3,000 on a capitalization weighted basis that are in the Russell indices. The Russell is kind of like the Standard & Poor's. They list stocks and they are a capitalization weighted index. The S&P 500 is a capitalization weighted index of 500 stocks. The Russell has 3,000 stocks. So it goes down clearly into what you would call small cap stocks And a lot of small cap emerging growth names are in the Russell 2000. So that's just, you're talking smaller companies that there's probably some companies in there that if they didn't qualify for these PPP loans, even though they were public companies, there's a separate lending facility that the Fed announced 2 Fridays ago. I believe it's called TELF, that they are have like $2.3 trillion available to liquefied banks that are lending money specifically to most likely small cap public companies that were probably too big to qualify, or ideally bigger than what the intent of the PPP lending program was for.
Right. That was solid. That was a solid explanation. Basically hit every point I was trying to make, because last time we saw the Russell go like this, folks, it was a good sign. So with the economy still opening up, and again, this is a great segue into the predictive value or lack thereof general election polls, because sometimes elections are decided like now in April. Sometimes they're not decided until late. And that is a big picture when you guys always hear me talk about it. It's Nicorette time, so get over it. When it's big picture time, then that's what we're always looking for. I wrote this article, which I'm going to read from. If you guys are watching on YouTube right now, it's in the info on the show. You can follow along with me if you want to follow along, but I'm not going to pull it up here. I'm going to read about it. Okay. George Bush, for instance, in 2004, he didn't beat John Kerry in November. He beat John Kerry in April and May. Barack Obama didn't beat Mitt Romney in November. He beat him the same way that George Bush beat John Kerry. Sometimes incumbent presidents, and Trump's not going to have that advantage here, unless that whole mentality issue becomes a big issue. Then we will look back and say that Donald Trump beat Joe Biden right about now. All right. Incumbent presidents, because of the laws, are able to whack their opponents and raise money and whack them before their opponents are allowed to whack back, because their primary isn't settled yet. Joe Biden is now the presumptive nominee. But going back to 2016, it wasn't like that. All right. We always had an electorate that wanted change, but didn't. Trump had to meet a presidential bar. That was really all this was about. He already had his justification, which I'll elaborate more on, because people always, I get that question a lot, Tim. What's a justification, right? We'll get it. We'll try to touch on that. I mean, that's a whole segment, really, but I'll try to touch on that. He had his justification, as in, why was he the man for the job at this time? The man in the moment, the right moment. Every presidential candidate who is a successful presidential candidate and becomes president needs a justification. Whether you like Barack Obama or not, he had clearly had a justification. Hope and change was his justification after a war-weary nation was plunged into economic despair through stupid programs that Bush did nothing to stop. And they took it out on the Republican Party and Tim and I have spoken about this on the show before. John McCain was the worst candidate to put up during that time. But Donald Trump's, he had his justification, and I'm telling you this because the article, if you're following along, I'm trying to give you context. It was late August, and people were arguing on television that nobody who has ever been this far behind this late in the game has ever gone on to win. And they had the debate, Tim, in North Carolina. All right. Remember? Trump had basically offered this. He met the bar, is my point. And then there would be the tape issues and everything. And he stayed within his justification, as in, I've never told you I was a great guy. I told you I was the guy who could fix these problems. I never told you I was morally superior. I told you I'm the guy who can stop the decline of our nation. And that was his justification. And it met it, right? But then you have someone, and I pick on Dana Perino in this article, not because I'm not picking on Dana Perino. It's just that I needed somebody to say something, Tim, that would really encapsulate what I was trying to say. And Dana Perino gave it to me. So she went on Fox and she said, all right, let's talk. Okay, so my point is, she was on O'Reilly and she said it was a Thursday. She said, no candidate who has ever been this far behind in August has gone on to win. Okay. And at that point, the only reason why the model, because at this point, our model did give Hillary like a 52% edge. Our model never swang like you saw these models, 72, 95%. Those kinds of certainties in election years like that are ridiculous. They're ridiculous in most election years. They're fabricating that stuff, folks. They're making it up. They have no idea what these are not serious likelihoods and probabilities, okay, which is why so many of them were made a fool of, but that statement alone was basically the representative of the thought at the time. Tim, do you remember this? He can't win, he's too far behind. Is that really true? It wasn't true. It was never true, right? It was never true. All right, so I actually I applauded her for calling the race as she saw it. You will remember, Tim, in 2012, she was more than willing to unskew the polls for Mitt Romney, right? But she wasn't going to do it in 2016. And I tried to make a few points here. One, that argument is not true. And two, as a sub point, that it was always like an apples to oranges comparison because they're going all the way back years and years. Back then it was Gallup, Tim. That was it. And a couple media polls, but it was Gallup. Now we had all these pollsters and their mothers coming out and releasing numbers. It really was never an accurate comparison. But let's go back and make those comparisons. Let's see it, okay? Let's pretend it's legitimate to compare Gallup to the umpteenth poll released by everyone and their mother, firm A, firm B, firm C, all right? Let's go back to 1948, which is the famous swing and a miss of Thomas Dewey versus Harry Truman. In August and September, these were Gallup's 5 poll results. And this is around the time period that I was making this argument and why I started here. Harry Truman, 37%. Thomas Dewey, 48, Tim. 48. Henry Wallace had 4%. Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat, had 2%. Their next poll the week later. Truman drops a point, Tim. Dewey gains a point. He's at 49. Henry Wallace, 5%. Strom Thurmond, 3%. So Wallace and Strom Thurmond each gained a point. This goes on all through August into September, throughout the mid of August to the end of September. The closest it ever got was 6 points. Harry Truman bumped up a point here and there. He eventually landed for the final August poll at 40%, while Thomas Dewey was at 46. All right. Now, remember, he in that second week in August, the second poll to end out August, Dewey was almost at 50%. And that is supposedly, right? You can't beat somebody who's at or near 50% if you're in the 30s, which is somewhere we have seen Trump a lot in some of these other polls, right? He's been in the 30s, right? So then, and he definitely was in 2016. He definitely was. So let's get into October, November, because my point is not just that it was never true in August. The general thing, and it's even true for us, we'll say it as well, it's Labor Day. That is the time people start to pay attention, but it doesn't mean that's the time the election was decided. And it doesn't mean that the polls couldn't have been wrong that recent, that close to Election Day. In October, the results for October, November for Gallup were Harry Truman, 45, Thomas Dewey, 50. Dewey hit the 50 mark, and it was generally believed that no matter what Harry Truman did, he was never going to be able to close that gap. You had Henry Wallace, who was a progressive, taking 4%, and you had Strom Thurmond, who was a Dixiecrat. It was a revolt within Truman's own party, taking 2%. Okay? And so the Democrats were losing their progressive wing to Harry Wallace, and they were losing their part of their racist wing to Strom Thurmond, right? I mean, whatever else could you call it? He was a Dixiecrat, folks. They didn't like civil rights. Anyway, the final result was a 10-point miss. It was 50% for Harry Truman and 45% for Thomas Dewey. You all may or may not remember the famous picture of Harry Truman holding up a picture from the Chicago Tribune that says Dewey wins, because the polls were not only wrong, the exit polls were wrong. They showed Truman was going to get thumped. In the end, they missed Truman's vote margin by 5 points. They missed Thomas Dewey's vote margin by 5 points for a net total screw up of 10 points. That is one of Gallup's few only misses. But the big media polls also gave Dewey that kind of edge, sometimes even bigger, Tim. Sometimes even bigger edges. Dewey would be at like 50, 52, and Truman would be at like 38. It looked terrible. He had no chance to win, and he did win, all right, in 1960. Richard Nixon versus John Kennedy, all right? JFK started the month of August with 44% of the vote. Richard Nixon started at 50%. Former vice president for Eisenhower, Ike, very well liked. He was over before it started. And I'm using August as the point because this is the argument they made, not me. In late August, it started to tighten. It was 47 up. And then Kennedy took a lead at the end of September, the third week in September, 48% to 47 before he lost it again. Okay. And then in the end, throughout October and November, it was a very tight race. Kennedy eventually took a slight lead, and the actual result was 50-50, right, Tim? I mean, that election was decided by corruption. And I mean, right? I mean, he stole West Virginia. He stole Illinois. I mean, that's just fact, folks. You got to get over it. So Kennedy was behind at the time period that people say somebody this far behind this by this month can't win. He was behind, and he would have lost that. And by the way, he took the lead, but he would have even lost that election if his crooked father didn't bribe people to steal 2 states away from Richard Nixon. That's just true. So the polls would have been wrong again. They would have been wrong again. All right, let's keep going. I mean, there's tons of them. If you're following along, folks, the point is obvious. There are tons of them here. In 88, George W. Bush thumped Michael Dukakis. Right, Tim? What was the electoral vote margin? It was like
I think he got 400. I think he had 400 electoral votes. It wasn't like an only 1 or 2 states like it was with Reagan's reelection.
It was huge.
Bush 41 had he had over 400 electoral votes.
Yes, it was
not
over
450, but he had 400.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just being a wise guy.
Between 410 and 420.
You know what? Before we get into the polls, I'm going to look it up because you'll see why. Wait until you see the polls from 1988. Wait until I read them to you. He had 426 electoral. 426. Right. Michael Dukakis got 111 electoral votes. That's it.
Right, but those polls swung wildly from
they did
post-convention to the vote.
And that Reagan won this election for Herbert Walker Bush. He did. Reagan won
basically Reagan's third term.
That's right. And when he went out there at the convention and he said that's when it swung. It was late the convention, I believe, Tim, was in late August, right?
Probably.
Yeah. In July, George Bush was trailing Michael Dukakis in the first set of Gallup polls, 47-41. Okay, that's 6 points. At the end of July, and by the way, big media polls were even worse. I'm just trying to use Gallup to try to have some kind of statistical soundness in this because they are, when they make these arguments, they're using Gallup. And it's only recently that we have the wealth of polls that we have to make this case. So it was never a sound argument to make, but I'm giving it to them. I'm conceding, even though it's not true. I'm pretending like we can concede this isn't an apples versus oranges. And I'm showing you how bad it is. This argument never held water. In the end of July, this is so bad, Michael Dukakis was ahead of George Herbert Walker Bush, 54-37, nearly 20 points, Tim. He's not just at 50, the critical 50 threshold, which does have merit to it, that argument. Not always, but it has merit.
Right.
He was at 54. He was midway through the 50s. This requires a lead like this to erase a lead like this. It requires something happening that changes people's minds, that tells them a good chunk that, okay, I'm not going to, and that included Democrats back then, Tim. You remember Reagan won huge numbers of Democrats, and they didn't like Herbert Walker Bush like they liked Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And Dukakis was winning his party back. That's what happened here.
Right.
And then in August, all through the month of August, basically Dukakis was at or around 50%. The final one was 49-42. So Bush had made some gain, but he wasn't able to drag Dukakis down. Bush bumped up 5. Dukakis fell 5. He wasn't able, though, to really close that gap on his own. Comes the convention, like Tim was saying. Here come the conventions. Dukakis looked weak. He was not impressive. And by that time, he was already starting to get whacked by some of the decisions that he made while being governor, particularly on crime, which is where you'll eventually get to the Willie Horton
famous Lee Atwater just brutalized him with ads.
That's right.
Some of the most effective political ads ever.
Tim, I remember those ads as a kid. I remember, I was young, but I remembered those ads. They were bad, especially the one, the Willie Horton ad.
Right.
That one is still burned in my brain. And if it wasn't for W, who convinced his dad to let him do that, because they didn't want, like Herbert Walker Bush didn't want to do this. He didn't. And
probably not. No.
Yeah, he didn't. That's what I've heard this from a lot of people.
Right.
He didn't want to do it. And W said, Daddy, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. And this nutcase, this liberal nutcase, is going to become president. He's going to dismantle what you've done with Reagan. Right. So eventually they let Lee go, and he decimated him. And then Reagan steps. So Dukakis has a lackluster convention, and the Republicans have theirs. And Reagan goes to the microphone, and he's already kind of hurting at this point. By the second time around, it was not effective, but he was still Reagan, even though you can tell he's diminished, but he's still Reagan. And he says, this is my guy. Within a week, the polls reverse. And when Dukakis was up 49-42. The very next poll a week later was 49-41 Bush. 47-42 was as tight as Dukakis could get it in the end of the month of September. That was as tight as he could get it. And then by October, Tim, he just started to run away. 50-40. By November, the last poll was 56-44. And the actual result turned out to be 53-46. So Bush was only overestimated by about 3 points. Dukakis got about 2 points more. But the lead was so big. The Reagan lead was so big. It was he could not make it up. And at this point, he was just getting bloodied. I got it. If you guys haven't seen those ads, if you're not old enough to remember them, or if you just forgot, maybe you didn't see them, go back and look at those ads. And back then, America was very different. And even 25% of the Democratic Party was not on board with letting out rapists because you feel bad for them. I mean, it was not like it is today. And those ads hurt. Coupled with them and Reagan, really, I mean, the
Caucus had terrible messaging too.
He was a horrible candidate.
He had terrible messaging, and the pictures of him in the tank to show that he was pro military defense, and was just didn't go over real well.
Next to Herbert Walker Bush. I mean, it was totally pointless. At that point, you just run on your own strengths. Right. You don't even try to do something like that. It's 11:28. Let me run through the rest, and then we'll get back and talk about, well, what's the deal, Rich? I mean, can they be trusted or not? I mean, we'll get into that more in detail. I'm just trying to prove a point here. Okay. Let's get to where his son's running in 2000. Gore was viewed to be the favorite, even though it is rudimentary. I'm going to say it again, or elementary, that it is very difficult for a party to win a third term, even though Herbert Walker Bush did it. Gore was still viewed as the favorite by the media class. They thought he would win. What we saw in truth was all through the spring, Bush had a pretty big lead, 47-41 by August, the first week of August, 54-37, 55-39. Then it tightened in the second week of August. Bush lost his lead, 47-46. It was tied for the rest of the month of August. Throughout September, Al Gore led most of September until the very end. He led in the very first poll. He was about tied, 46-45 in the second one, which was basically the beginning of September. Then all throughout the month of September, he widened it out to a 10-point lead. At one point, he was up 51-41, Tim, in the end of September. I mean, that was looking like a pretty big lead. He only started to lose it in the final week of September, and then it was essentially tied. Going into August, they traded leads. Okay, with Bush leading more than Gore, but they traded leads, and Bush's lead was always smaller than Gore's, with the exception of a 51-40 in the middle of October that gave away pretty quick.
That had to be a complete outlier poll.
It was, as you know, Gore, and this is Gallup. If you look at the media polls, Gore was ahead more than Bush.
Right.
If you look at during this time period. If you look at the media polls, this is just basically a Gallup tracking thing, And then in the end, Gallup had Bush 48-46, and it was 48-48. But my point is, again, those early polls had no predictive value, right? So there's the bottom line is, and I'm going to take this break real quick and we'll come back and talk about, you know what? Let me save it for after the fact, Tim, because if I get into the forecasts, right? If I get into them, then it's going to draw me into another argument I wanted to save for the next segment anyway. So let me back up away. I'm blind as a bat, folks, so I have to lean in to read. But okay, so when we come back, we'll talk about because of course, I tell you, don't dismiss polls. Don't dismiss them. But at the same time, you can't take these arguments at face value. They almost all of their conventional wisdom almost never holds up to scrutiny. And we can do myriad segments on the conventional wisdom. This is just one. Dana Perino didn't make that up. That has long been conventional wisdom, and it is not true. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of those forecasts in 2016 and when it is a legit, what we should be taking from them. All right. So it is 11:32 on Monday, April 27th. You're watching Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit. I am the People's Pundit. You guys, if you're not following me on Twitter, go ahead and do so. It is at Peoples_Pundit on Twitter. And I'm joined by Tim the Source Anderson. Same thing. If you're not following him on Twitter, folks, follow along at TJ Anderson1. And if you do, don't forget to look in the morning on his market comments on Twitter. And you'll know basically where we're going with the show if you guys are looking at those. Always very insightful. If you guys are watching on Periscope, give us those hearts. Like the account that you're watching it on. It streams on mine and on People's Pundit Daily. Go ahead and follow them both. That would be great if you're a Periscope viewer. If you watch Facebook Live, like the page. People's Pundit Daily is the page this airs on. And then it will notify you when we go live. It'll give you a heads up, actually. So if we set it off 30 minutes ahead of time, it'll give you time to get there and do what you got to do if you want to watch it live. Same thing with YouTube. If you subscribe to People's Pundit Daily on YouTube, it will give you a heads up before we go live. And this way you're not, taken off the last minute. Don't forget to subscribe to the page, folks. We're making that milestone. We're doing great. Let's keep it up and give us the thumbs up on the episodes themselves. The ultimate way to support the show is to subscribe to People's Pundit Daily. Get some data for your dollar. And you can do that by going to peoplespunditdaily.com and finding the digital subscriptions. There's several options there. Or you could just go to the short link, which will redirect you. ppdnews.us/subscribe. ppdnews.us/subscribe. It is 11:33. Let's see what's going on out there in the markets before we circle back and wrap up the segment on early general election polling. What's going on out there, Tim?
Well, the markets are extending their gains from earlier in the morning. In case you missed it earlier, it's very significant to me that the markets are going completely the opposite direction from oil. Oil is down 27%. It's down $4.60. It's trading below $12.50 a barrel. It had closed out last week just below $17. This is a huge move in oil. Today, we had extremely large move to the downside last Monday and Tuesday in oil. The markets did not like it. They went down 5% over 2 days. Today, they are not doing that. The S&P, Dow, and Nasdaq are all up at least 1.25%. The Russell 2000 is up 3%. It's not even 12 o'clock yet. There's over 4 hours in the trading day. I'll be very intrigued to see if the market can hold on to these gains throughout the remainder of the day. I think the market's trading on
that
the very
run.
Positive optics of the economy starting to get turned back on, with about 10 to 12 states either today or later in the week relaxing their stay-at-home guidelines for a variety of different businesses.
Yeah, and just to give people, that Russell run, man, that's nice, and it can hold those throughout the day, Tim. Things happen when we get off the show, but if it can hold that, that would be great. So, people, if you want to know what to look for when we get off the show here today in about a half hour, 25 minutes, then that would be it, right, Tim? I mean, what you say, if it can hold that, then wow. Yeah, there's some great comments here, about Dukakis' debate performance and Truman being the OG dark horse. He was the OG dark horse, that is, you could just see it on his face. And, when he, in that picture, in that famous picture, he couldn't believe it. Although he did take his message very much like Trump. He took his message. He knew he was down in the polls, or at least that's what they all said. And he felt they were accurate. And he said, the only thing I can do is crisscross the country and talk to the working man and give him my story, and tell them my story, my vision. And if they reward me, they do. If they don't, they don't. And in that famous picture, he's got that, eating grin. And he's like, because, that was hard work. That was good old, very much like 2016, good old fashioned campaign, right? He outworked Dewey. He outworked him. And Trump outworked Hillary, and he's going to outwork Joe Biden. I don't care what people say. I have never seen a candidate run around the country the way Donald Trump ran around the country. I mean, multiple events in multiple states in the single day. Like Biden
was having 6 or 7. He was having 6 or 7
crazy
rallies a day that last week.
That was crazy. And Biden's not going to be able to keep up with that.
Oh,
Tim.
God, no.
No way. And the media making all these, before I get into this real quick, the media making all this hay about, Obama endorses. Now Pelosi this morning is the big headline from Sunday. Who the hell were they supposed to endorse? I mean, it's just like so ridiculous, Tim. As if they were first of all, Vernon endorsing Trump is a bigger story. There's been several Democrats now who have endorsed Donald Trump. That is a much bigger story. Just like it was that there were Democrats who endorsed Chris Christie for his reelection over Kim. And, Kim got the endorsements of people like Barack Obama. Like, of course she was going to. Of course. But what matters, I'm telling you, in some of these states, if Trump can peel off state legislatures like that, state legislators, those are the ones who have to get out the vote in their church, Tim. And then, that's not good. And I have just a quick note on Trump's polling, because we're going to talk about it now in a second anyway. I was talking to a buddy of mine this morning who wanted to know what I saw in the latest numbers. And just to tell everybody, who have been asking whether we're going to track like we did last year, there's a couple media outlets that we've been talking with partnering. I'm going to pick one or two and to do some state level polling, and then partner with to do. I will not do this alone on People's Pundit Daily again this year like we did. It was a lot of money. And for people who just don't understand this, it was a ton of money. I will partner with somebody and we'll poll. And there's a couple of people we're speaking with now about that. I'll pick one eventually, one that feels right. Like we have synergy. If I can find one that feels right, that I trust and I think highly of, then we'll do it. Other than that, then it's just not going to be the same as it was in 2016 is my point. It's just, my wife will kill me, but yeah. So anyway, getting into what I was telling him, Trump's numbers, there has been a dip against Biden, not as much as I would suggest you'll see in some other polling, but the dip is among white people, which is kind of funny to me, and not funny, but interesting. The dip is among white people. He always had an issue with educated white people, Tim, especially in those particular suburbs that we talk about. It is not just the suburb, and people who watch the show know this. It is not just the suburb. It is a metro suburb. It is different. It's a more diverse, more educated suburbs. Anyway, there has been this dip among them. He never polled particularly well with this group, even going back to 2016. In the end, they did go to him, at least, more than media polls suggested. And you can go and look at the table or the tracker on PPD and you'll see it. I mean, it gives you all the demographic breakdowns. In the end, they moved to him. Just like in the end, most minority voters who were undecided went to Hillary Clinton. This time, however, Trump's vote among Hispanics is much larger. It is. I mean, Tim, sometimes it's as low as like 6 points. Sometimes it's as high as like 15. It's very interesting some places, especially in a state like Florida. His Puerto Rican vote was weak. That was his weakest vote down here with Hispanics. It's just not. There's more Puerto Rican votes in big areas than there are like Mexicans, which typically go liberal, except for Texas. They are not full blown as they are other places. With Trump, his Hispanic vote it's real. His increase in the Hispanic vote and his increase in the black vote, that's going to be very interesting to me come November, whether or not. Or not even whether or not. I don't think it's a matter of whether or not he'll increase his vote share among these groups. He's going to. I really think he is now. I'm like pretty convinced that's going to happen. It's a question of two questions. One, by how much? And then two, will those white voters who in the end went back to him anyway, go back to him again? Because when we're looking at like the southeastern suburbs outside the Twin Cities, he's doing better there than he did in 2016, which gives him a real shot at carrying a state like Minnesota if all other things are equal, which is always hard in an election, but you know what I mean, hypothetically. But then there are some other areas which may not matter for a general election, Tim, but could matter for the national vote, like areas in like Illinois and where it's just not, I don't know, it's weird. It's strange. What's happening is strange. But I can tell you, he got 31% or 33% of the Hispanic vote, depending on if you believe the exit polls. Romney got 27 or something. I don't know, so roughly around. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank right now. These are normally numbers I pull out of my hat. But he can touch among Puerto Rican voters. He can touch the low 40s, which is a big problem, for a Democrat. They need that vote nationally by like 75-25 or 70-30. And if he ends up with 38% of the Hispanic vote, Tim, and those white voters come back, it's that's bad for Democrats. That's bad. Really bad.
Especially combined with if the African American vote hits 12 to 15%.
Yeah. I'm thinking 12 is reasonable. It's a reasonable mark.
That could be game over.
12 is a reason, especially since Joe Biden.
12, I think, is very doable. I do
too.
I think he could do 15. That would be the highest percentage of African American vote a Republican has got. I think the high water mark right now is Reagan at 14 in his reelection.
Unless you go back to Nixon.
Right.
You go back to right. But modern Republican vote shares. I just think too that they're hard. Black voters are hard to poll. And I have been like getting these big numbers that are like close to 30%. All right.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you guys where I'm going with this. I've been getting these big numbers that are like raw, close to 30%. When you wait for region and education, which if you were watching on Friday, is a big failure in 2016, that brings it down to reality, where you think is reality, right? But sometimes, Tim, it's not bringing it down like that much. Like, so it's still like 16, 18%. That's a lot. And they tend to overpoll. I have to say this. Black voters tend Republican vote shares, at least in my polling. I've seen others where a Republican candidate or Trump will get like 0 or 2. It's like ridiculous. It's not even it's not even statistically possible,
Right.
but that's what they come up with. With me, my experience is that there's always a couple of points there that don't come in for the Republican. That's right. So if it's 16, let's say 16, 18, all right, let's say he gets it. It's not unreasonable if that's overblown or, then it's not unreasonable to think that it could be 12 or 13 or 14. That's not unreasonable. And the problem for Joe Biden,
it sounds like low numbers, 12 to 14.
It's a big shift.
It's
a lot
real
of votes.
problem.
That's a lot of votes. Yeah, it's a real problem. He won this primary on black voters, Tim, almost solely. I mean, that they saved him for sure. They saved him for a total, from total oblivion and embarrassment in South Carolina. They salvaged and resuscitated his campaign. Right. And my point is, the other thing that Joe Biden did, other group Joe Biden did well with, were those white voters that we're talking about. But there's too many independents to think that Trump is blocked out from getting higher among them, like we saw in 2016. They seem to favor Hillary Clinton. They actually voted for her in better numbers. Bernie got the rural vote. Hillary got those voters. And the independents that crossed over to vote in the Democratic election where there are open primaries, she got those voters in 2016. And then they did it's something miraculous happened. They came back enough in places like Philadelphia, Tim, and voted for him at high enough rates where he carried the state of Pennsylvania. Like he changed their mind is my point. And if they come back at those, or at least close to those rates, and he pulls out like 40 or 42% of the Hispanic voter, he doesn't even need that, and then 12 to 13, I'm going low. I'm trying to be conservative here.
Yep.
12% of the black vote. If those white voters come back, it's going to be another shocker is my point. A big shocker. Let's real quick, because it's 11:47. I just want to bring some notables. 2016, Tim, is the all-time biggest screw up, at least in people's minds. And if you want to defend the polls, they were in the margin of error. Not if you take out the pollsters the media don't like. If you take them out, those polls were not in the margin of error anymore. If you just put in big media's favorite gold standard polls, Donald Trump had no path to the presidency. None. He was done. And then that's what is burned in everybody's mind. But in truth, because we started our model in 2014, in truth, that hasn't been the only screw up. And it's just that was the one most people were paying attention to. And we started this model because of those screw ups. And they always seem to screw up against the Republican. It was like amazing. How could they always misfire, in some against the Republican? Listen to this. Chris Cillizza, right? Who Trump called the dumbest political pundit ever, right? Right. He now works at CNN, but he used to work at the Washington Post, and he ran the election lab at the Washington Post. On August 27th, now remember the time frame, he concluded that Senator Mark Udall had a 64% chance of winning. In late September, he was writing, he updated his model, and he gave Udall a 94% chance of winning. He was beat by Cory Gardner. This is 2014 again, the Senate race in Colorado. Right. He was defeated by Cory Gardner. And if you're following along on this story, the link in that paragraph where we're talking about this, it will take you directly to a page where we talk about whether turnout really was the reason why Democrats lost those seats in 2014. It wasn't. And I ran a little hypothetical where we gave people like Mark Udall, for instance, Barack Obama's electorate. And we recalculated to tell you that it would have shaved only a little over a point off of Cory Gardner's total margin against Mark Udall. He just won. He won outright, and he won because he did so much better among Hispanics than anyone expected that he was going to do. And even if those voters, there were voters, Tim, who voted for Barack Obama, but voted for Cory Gardner. That's it. I think Cory Gardner is one of the most vulnerable, right, going into this election, but he completely outperformed the polls and the models. He just did. And then speaking of Chris Cillizza, before we get off of him, in mid-September, he updated his model, and he said that Democrats now, because he had Republicans as the favorite in the Senate before, he said Democrats now have the upper hand to hold it. They are now favored to hold the upper chamber in the 2014 election. I kid you not. It's just that people weren't really paying attention, Tim. Until 2016, they weren't really paying attention. Nate Silver gave Trump a 5% chance of winning the Republican nomination. That was Mr. Guru's thought on that. That's what the model over at 538 gave Trump a 5% chance of winning. He gave a generic Republican about a 50-50 chance, even though the history clearly showed it was very hard for a party to hold on to the White House for 3 consecutive terms. And then once it became Donald Trump, the nominee became Donald Trump, that 50-50 chance evaporated. And, we all know about the New York Times. I mean, we all know about the Huffington Post, right? What were they? They were the worst, Tim. 97. I didn't even put them in there. Right. I specifically talked about Chris, who again he was at the Fix, and he was the head of the election lab at the Washington Post. Now he's at the CNN. Yeah, he's at CNN.
Perfect fit for them.
Perfect fit. Democrats, quote Chris Cillizza right here. Democrats now have a 51% chance of holding the Senate. That's Chris's model from 2014. And yes, people do revise their stuff after the election. I've seen it. With my own eyes. All right. It's just, that's not the reality. The article is linked right there. You can go back. If they've changed it, maybe they've changed it, hit the way back. It's there. He said the Democrats were going to hold the Senate. And perfect example was in Colorado. Of course, Mark Udall went off to get defeated, and that's it. General election polls at this point, Tim, aren't useless. They're not useless, but they just don't have predictive value, which is the lesson of the story here. They don't have predictive value at this point. And based on the last, what I read through since 1945, and somebody even mentioned even before that 1936 survey, Gallup only missed, I think, twice in since Dewey. They missed the Romney thing, and then they stopped. They had a very good track record. If only missing 2 elections is all that's pretty good, Tim. But that's good.
Because you're talking some close elections too.
That's right. But what is the difference between whether the polls were accurate in August or whether they were accurate in September? As you just saw, many of them really didn't catch the real state of the race until late October, the 3rd to 4th week in October, which in 2016 was right about the time Donald Trump started surging, even though most of the polls didn't show him surging enough. He was still going to lose. And the point I'm making here is if you go back and you had a timeline and you superimpose the timeline over their polling, you would see that some big picture event or narrative that decided that election. What was the mood of the electorate? Things that are worth asking right now, people don't ask. In 2014, which we were just talking about, Joni Ernst against I forgot his name already, Brad something, right? He was going to win that race until Joni Ernst took the lead late. But if you were polling it like we were polling it, we had a little panel for Iowa of independents. They still told us that they wanted a Republican-controlled Senate. They didn't favor stricter gun control laws. You have to try to find the mood of the electorate and that's how you know whether a candidate has a justification. What's the mood going to be? What's the overarching story of that election? And that's how you learn how to that's how you can tell, later, of course, is my point too, Tim. You're not going to know most of the time. You're not going to know, is this poll right in August? Is that one right in September? You just won't. Later on, that story becomes clear, but that's how you really learn how to predict elections, by knowing how to predict what that story is going to be. So sometimes the polls weren't right until late October. Sometimes they were right in September and then were wrong in late October, right? I mean, that's the point I was trying to give to everybody. What's your thoughts on it before I give the outro and swig a thing of water here?
I just think that, there have been some very, very close races that swung significantly in the last 3 weeks of the campaign. Even the first Reagan election, he was viewed to be that was viewed to be a very, very, very tight race between him and Jimmy Carter. And that swung very sharply, very late.
Yeah, but that's a great example.
But if you have late debates, that final debate probably did they only have one debate then?
They did. 1980.
Yeah.
One
that
debate.
debate was I believe it was the last week in October, and Reagan showed himself to be very presidential, and he did very well in that debate with the famous "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?"
Yep. And, I didn't include in that little rattle off, again, for people who, didn't hear, I didn't include media polls. I just was including Gallup. In 1980, the final USA Today poll had Carter up by 2. It's a tight race going into the election day. That's the headline on USA Today. You could Google it and find it.
That was probably an aged poll in reality.
It was, right.
That they had taken probably 2 weeks earlier and just tabulated it, a few days before the vote, but it swung significantly over the last 2 weekends.
Reagan met that. I think, Tim, the debate could be seen as an event. I know a lot of people, smart people, who say that debate was it. There's that. And maybe we'll get into this tomorrow about what justifications and presidential bars mean. And, that is when Reagan met the bar. So there was a lot of questions about whether Reagan was a madman with a nuke, right? You remember that? It was whether he was a madman with a nuke, whether he was going to take away Social Security and all sorts of stuff. Yep. When Reagan met the bar, he showed up with his A game, that debate, and he met the presidential bar. And people said, you know what? I think Reagan can do this job. And that was it. That's sometimes all it will take. With Trump, and I know we're running out of time here, but I really want to get this out. We were talking about Trump. With Trump, people always wanted somebody other than Hillary Clinton, even before her favorabilities tanked because they were great when she started. But then when the race started, he killed her. And the email stuff killed her. He beat her so bloody. Biden, you're going to get beat up too, buddy. And I got to tell you, you enjoy your favorability rating now, which is not good, by the way. Biden's favorability is not great right now. What happened is that debate, Tim, after Access Hollywood, the first debate was like, Trump supporters liked it, but it wasn't what I was looking for as far as whether or not he'd meet that threshold. In the second debate, everyone knew he had the Access Hollywood thing looming over him, and he showed up. And that is the night he met the presidential bar. It's not necessarily that the debate swings it itself. It's that people finally see him as someone who can do the job. and then that's it. It matters. I mean, I would love to spend more than just a few minutes on this. It's so important. And somebody asked a great question, but I'll have to answer it tomorrow about how much bad polls throw off good ones and throw off the averages. That absolutely happens. And that's because of herding and mirroring, depending on what we talked about that a little bit on Friday too. But let's save that, guys, for tomorrow's show. It's a great show. I want to thank you guys all for watching again. You're watching Inside the Numbers Monday through Friday, 10 o'clock, 8 a.m. to noon Eastern Standard Time. So it's Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit. I am the People's Pundit. You guys can follow me on Twitter at Peoples_Pundit. And I'm always joined by Tim the Source Anderson. Folks, follow him on Twitter at TJ Anderson1. We will be back again. Don't forget to subscribe and like and give us those thumbs up. And we will be back again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Can't wait for it, folks. All the best.